In the world of Chainsaw Man, everything begins with fear. Fear of guns. Fear of blood. Fear of darkness. Fear of dying alone in a narrow alley while something with too many teeth crawls out of the dark. Fear gives birth to devils. That is the rule. That is the system. That is how the world survives, barely. So when the alarms start screaming in Tokyo's Special Ward 4, nobody is surprised. Another devil. Another evacuation. Another cleanup. Public safety devil hunters move fast. They always do. Black suits, tired eyes, weapons that look too small for the nightmares they're about to face. Witnesses report a shadow-based entity. Command assumes it's a devil. They're wronged. It starts in an abandoned subway station. Flickering lights. Blood on the tiles. A devil shaped like a centipede, fused with human hands, born from the fear of underground spaces. It screams. The sound alone makes civilians vomit. Fear pours into the air like gasoline. And then, silence. Not because the devil stops screaming, but because something steps into the dark. A young man, black coat, calm eyes, no visible weapon. He doesn't run. He doesn't shout. He doesn't transform. He simply stands there, as if the devil is an inconvenience rather than a threat. The devil lunges. And that's when the shadows move. Not his shadow. Shadows, plural. They peel themselves off the walls, the floor, the ceiling, stretching, thickening, rising like liquid night given shape. Soldiers. Knights. Creatures that look like death remembered how to walk. They don't roar. They don't howl. They obey. In less than 10 seconds, the devil is gone. Not exploded. Not erased by holy light. Executed. And when it dies, something even stranger happens. The fear in the air doesn't spike. It collapses. As if the world itself exhales. Public safety arrives too late. They always do. Body cams show something no one can explain. No devil signature. No contract residue. No transformation sequence. Just a man standing among shadows that refuse to disperse. An analyst pauses the footage. Rewinds. Zooms in. Devils don't cast shadows, she says slowly. Everyone in the room knows this. Devils are born from fear, not from physical laws. They don't obey light. They don't reflect it. But this man, the shadows bow to him. Public safety tries to classify him. Not a devil. Not a fiend. Not a hybrid. No contract detected. Someone finally says it out loud. If he's not powered by fear, then what the hell is he? His name, when they finally get it, is Sung Jin-Woo. No records in Japan. No devil contracts anywhere in the world. No history of fear-based incidents. He doesn't hunt devils because he hates them. He hunts them because that's what he does. In his world, monsters came from gates. From dungeons. From places where humanity learned quickly that screaming didn't save you. Only clearing the dungeon did. Fear wasn't power. Victory was. Public safety sends a scout team to observe him. They don't engage. They don't threaten. They watch. Jin-Woo walks through a devil-infested district like a man walking through rain. A leech devil crawls out of a sewer. It senses no fear from him. Devils rely on fear the way humans rely on oxygen. This one hesitates. That hesitation is fatal. A shadow spear appears through its skull. The devil dies without ceremony. And then, the shadows multiply. Public safety realizes something horrifying. Every devil Jin-Woo kills doesn't leave a corpse that empowers fear. It leaves nothing. No lingering terror. No emotional echo. Just silence. Devils exist because humans fear them. That fear loops. Devils kill right arrow, humans fear. More right arrow, devils grow stronger. But Jin-Woo interrupts the loop. He doesn't inspire fear. He inspires finality. Civilians who witness him don't scream. They stare. Because for the first time, the monster doesn't feel eternal. It feels temporary. And that is dangerous. Not for humans. For devils. High above the city, Makima watches reports scroll across a screen. She doesn't frown. She smiles. Because this man doesn't fit her world. And anything that doesn't fit must either be controlled or removed. She notices something else too. His shadows don't behave like devils. They don't hunger. They don't bargains. They don't demand contracts. They exist because he allows them to. Makima whispers. He doesn't belong to fear. And for the first time in a long time, she sounds uneasy. A public safety agent finally sees them up close. Not devils. Not fiends. Soldiers. Each one bears scars. Each one stands at attention. Each one looks like something that died fighting and chose to keep fighting. They don't radiate malice. They radiate loyalties. The agent realizes the truth too late. These shadows aren't manifestations of terror. They are manifestations of death already conquered. Public safety files a report with a red label. Anomaly NON fear-based entity. No countermeasures listed. No containment plan approved. Because how do you contain someone who does? Feed on fear. How do you weaken a being who grows stronger by surviving? How do you threaten a man who already died once and came back crowned? In the Chainsaw Man world, devils rule because humans are afraid to die. But Sung Jin-Woo already learned something devils never did. Death isn't the end. It's a resource. And as shadows stretch across Tokyo that night, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Devils don't cast shadows. He does. And that changes everything. In the world of Chainsaw Man, classification is power. If public safety can name you, they can study you, contain you, control you. Devil, fiend, hybrid, human with a contract. Every threat fits somewhere. Every threat except one. High above Tokyo, in a room too clean to feel human, Makima reads the report again. Shadow-based combat entity. No fear resonance detected. Multiple autonomous subordinates. Absolute obedience. Makima tilts her head. She doesn't doubt the data. She doubts reality. Then we'll label him, she says calmly. Everything has a category. Public safety agrees. They always do. Makima chooses the closest answer. Devil hybrid. It makes sense on paper. Human appearance. Non-human abilities. Extraordinary regeneration. Summoning power. Hybrids don't require fear the same way devils do. Hybrids are manageable. Controllable. Makima smiles. The system works again. Or so she thinks. Jin-Woo is summoned. No chains. No weapons drawn. No threats. Makima believes intimidation is unnecessary. She sits across from Sung Jin-Woo, hands folded, expression gentle. "You're a hybrid," she says softly. "Human and devil." Jin-Woo listens. He always does. "Your power source," Makima continues, "must be registered. Every devil has a fear. Every hybrid has an origin." Silence. Makima leans forward slightly. "So tell me," she asks, "what fear created you?" Jin-Woo doesn't answer immediately. Not because he's afraid. Because the question itself is wrong. "Fear," he repeats. He looks genuinely confused. Makima notices this. That's odd. Devils love their fear. Hybrids resent it. Fiends despise it. But Jin-Woo, he doesn't recognize it. "I didn't come from fear," he says. Makima's smile freezes just a fraction. "That's not possible," she replies gently. "All power here comes from fear." Jin-Woo meets her eyes. "Then your system is incomplete." Makima doesn't argue. She tests. She arranges an experiment. A controlled devil encounter. Maximum civilian panic. Fear levels spiking off the charts. If Jin-Woo is a devil or hybrid, his power should react. Grow. Mutate. Resonate. The devil attacks. People scream. Fear floods the streets. Makima watches carefully. Jin-Woo moves. And nothing changes. No surge. No distortion. No reaction to fear at all. His shadows don't swell. They don't sharpen. They simply execute the devil with the same precision as before. Makima's smile disappears. Makima tries something else. Control. Her power wraps around devils like gravity. Around humans like inevitability. She reaches out. Commands Jin-Woo. Not loudly. Not forcefully. Just expects obedience. And for the first time, the command doesn't land. Jin-Woo feels it. Acknowledges it. Steps through it like mist. Makima blinks. Once, she has never failed to command something she understands. Makima finally sees it. Devils gain power from fear given to them. Humans gain power from contracts taken from devils. But Jin-Woo, he doesn't borrow power. He accumulates it. Every battle survived. Every death overcome. Every enemy defeated. His strength isn't external. It's earned. Fear doesn't feed him. Choice does. Will does. Makima flips through mental categories. Devil, no. Hybrid, no. Human, no. Jin-Woo doesn't belong to the Chainsaw Man ecosystem. He's not part of the food chain. He's an invasive species. One that doesn't obey the laws of fear. And systems hate what they can't define. Makima asks one final question. If you're not a devil, she says, voice calm again, then what are you? Jin-Woo stands. Shadows respond instantly. Not aggressively. Respectfully. I was human, he says. Makima listens. I died, Jin-Woo continues. And I came back because I refused to stay weak. The room feels smaller. I rule shadows, he finishes. Not because they fear me. They follow me because I won. For the first time in her existence, Makima doesn't know what move comes next. Control won't work. Fear won't work. Classification won't work. She smiles. Not her usual smile. A real one. Small, uncertain, confused. And that terrifies her. Devils are born from fear. Hybrids are chained by contracts. But Sung Jin-Woo, he stands outside the system. A king not crowned by terror, but by survival. And as Makima watches his shadow stretch across the floor, she understands the truth too late. The Shadow Monarch is not a devil. And that makes him something far more dangerous. In the world of Chainsaw Man, monsters announce themselves loudly. They scream. They blood. They reek of fear. That's age. Our hunters survive by learning the smell of danger. But when Sung Jin-Woo first passes Denji in a public safety hallway, something feels wrong. Not threatening. Not monstrous. Just wrong. Jin-Woo stops walking. Denji keeps going, hands in pockets, humming off-key, completely unaware that he's just tripped every survival instinct Jin-Woo has. It's the smell. Not blood. Not fear. Not rot. It smells like rusted chains and old promises. Like a contract that's been stretched too thin. Jin-Woo turns his head slowly. Denji looks normal, too normal. Messy blonde hair. Lazy posture. A heartbeat that doesn't belong to a devil. But something else is there. Something ancient. Something tired. In Jin-Woo's world, cursed artifacts existed. Weapons that gave power, but took pieces of their wielder with every use. Tools that saved lives until they decided to collect a debt. Hunters didn't hate those artifacts. They pitied them. Because the artifact always survived. The human never did. As Jin-Woo watches Denji laugh with another agent, the thought hits him fully. This boy isn't a monster. He's a container. Denji talks too much. About food. About girls. About how cool it is that he gets to sleep indoors now. He doesn't talk about fear. He doesn't talk about the cost. That's the most dangerous part. People who understand their contracts are cautious. People who don't get consumed. Denji grins at Jin-Woo. Hey, you new, he asks. You don't look like a suit. Jin-Woo studies him carefully. You don't smell like a devil, Jin-Woo replies. Denji blinks. That's a weird thing to say to someone. Then Jin-Woo senses it. Not Denji. Behind Denji. A presence curled deep in his chest, quiet but alert, like a sleeping blade that wakes when blood spills. Jin-Woo's shadows stir. Not aggressively. Cautiously. They recognize something that survived extinction. Jin-Woo exhales slowly. So that's it. A devil not wearing fear, but loyalty. Jin-Woo's gaze sharpens. Denji feels a chill for no reason. Inside him, Pachita opens one eye. Not in anger. In recognition. Two beings who clawed their way back from nothing. Two survivors who paid in blood. Jin-Woo doesn't bow. But he acknowledges. Pachita does the same. No words. No hostility. Just understanding. Jin-Woo speaks quietly. Do you know what you gave up? He asks. Denji laughs. Of my heart, kinda, but I got chainsaws, so fair trade right. Jin-Woo doesn't smile. That wasn't a fair deal, he says. Denji shrugs, didn't really have a choice. That's when it hits Jin-Woo hardest. Denji didn't bargain. He survived. And survival contracts are the cruelest ones. Jin-Woo doesn't see Denji as an ally. He doesn't see him as an enemy. He sees him the way veteran hunters see cursed weapons sealed in vaults. Useful, unstable, doomed if overused. Denji is powerful, but every time he pulls the cord, something inside him is consumed. And Denji doesn't even notice. Jin-Woo lines closer. Power that eats you, he says, always asks for more. Denji squints, you some kind of therapist or something. No, Jin-Woo replies, I'm a hunter. Denji grins, cool, I hunt stuff too. Jin-Woo looks away. No, he thinks. You let it hunt through you. From a distance, cameras record the interaction. Analysts note nothing unusual. 2 assets. 2 weapons. No incident. They miss the truth. Jin-Woo has already classified Denji. Not as a devil. Not as a hybrid. But as a tragedy in progress. As they part ways, Denji waves. See you around, Shadow Guy. Jin-Woo doesn't respond. Because hunters don't get attached to cursed artifacts. They only decide one thing. How long until it breaks? And whether anyone can be saved when it does. Denji smells like a broken contract. Not because he's weak, but because he never understood the price. And Sung Jin-Woo, a man who died, came back and chose his power, knows exactly how these stories end. Unless someone intervenes, in the world of Chainsaw Man, control is not violence. It's not shouting. It's not force. Control is certainty. Makima doesn't threaten people. She doesn't beg devils. She simply decides what something is allowed to be. And until now, nothing has ever refused her decision. Makima never rushes. That's why she wins. When reports confirm that Sung Jin-Woo cannot be classified, cannot be commanded indirectly, and cannot be predicted, she doesn't panic. She prepares. She arranges a meeting. No guards. No weapons. No hostile intent. Because Makima knows something most people don't. Power reveals itself fastest when it believes it is safe. The room is white. Too white. A place designed to erase intimidation, erase resistance, erase emotion. Makima sits across from Sung Jin-Woo. She smiles. Not sweet. Not cruel. Certain. Thank you for coming, she says. Jin-Woo nods once. Shadows rest behind him, not spreading, not reacting. Waiting. Makima notices that. Everything else reacts to her. People line ends. Devils quiet down. Even monsters listen. But Jin-Woo's shadows. They don't acknowledge her presence at all. Makima doesn't announce what she's doing. She never does. Her power doesn't feel like a shove. It feels like gravity. An expectation imposed on reality. She looks at Jin-Woo and decides. You will obey. The command flows. Invisible. Absolute. Flawless. It has never failed. Jin-Woo feels it. Not as pressure. Not as threat. As an idea being offered to him. He processes it. Rejects it. And the command dissolves. Makima blinks. Once. That has never happened. Makima tries again. Not harder. More precisely. She adjusts the vector. Authority over devils, authority over humans, authority over the narrative itself. She strips the command down to its purest form. Submit. Jin-Woo exhales. His shadows shift. Not aggressively. Not defensively. They simply stand closer. Like soldiers recognizing a hostile flag. Makima feels it then. Resistance. Not rebellions. Independence. Makima understands systems. Fear creates devils. Contracts bind humans. Obedience keeps the world orderly. Her power works because everything wants something. Safety. Love. Survival. She gives those things shape. But Jin-Woo. He doesn't want. He decided. Long before he ever entered this world. He decided when he chose death over weakness. When he stood up after dying. When he ruled shadows instead of begging light. Makima cannot control what does not seek permission to exist. Makima shifts tactics. She targets the shadows instead. Devils submit. Vines freeze. Hybrids hesitate. She issues the command outward. The shadows don't respond. Not because they can't hear, but because she is not their authority. They don't recognize her as above Jin-Woo. They don't recognize anything as above Jin-Woo. Makima finally understands. These shadows are not extensions of fear. They are extensions of victory. Makima speaks again. You're powerful, she says. But power can always be directed. Jin-Woo looks at her. You rule because others kneel, he replies calmly. Makima tilts her head. And you. I kneel to no one. The words are not a challenge. They're a fact. Makima has erased nations. Broken devils older than memory. Reshaped lives with a sentence. But now, she has reached the edge of her influence. She cannot dominate Jin-Woo. She cannot lash him. She cannot even frame him properly inside her worldview. And something else frightens her more than failure. He isn't resisting her. He simply exists beyond her reach. Makima smiles again. But this time it's different. Tighter, sharper, calculated. Not because she succeeded, but because she learned something vital. This is the first being she cannot control. Which means, if she wants her perfect world, he cannot be allowed to remain free. You can control devils. You can control humans. You can control fear itself. But you cannot control a king who already conquered death and chose his own crown. And as Makima watches Sung Jin-Woo leave the room, shadows following him like loyal history, she realizes the truth too late. The most dangerous power in this world is not fear. It is will. And she has finally met something stronger than control. In the world of Chainsaw Man, fear is currency. The more people fear you, the more real you become. That's the foundation of everything. Devils don't train. They don't evolve. They don't improve through effort. They are fed. Fed by screams. Fed by rumors. Fed by the simple human instinct to imagine the worst. Fear is infinite. Or at least it used to be. For decades, the system worked. A devil appears. People panic. The devil grows stronger. Devil hunters fight back. Some die. Fear spikes again. Hell is satisfied. Because even when devils die, fear survives. Fear always survives. That's why hell never worried about extinction. Until Sung Jin-Woo arrived. Public safety notices it first. Devil activity drops in districts Jin-Woo patrols. Not because devils are being hunted harder, but because they are being hunted cleanly. No prolonged battles. No collateral terror. No survivors screaming about what they saw. Devils disappear. And when they do, fear doesn't linger. Analysts can't explain it. Because Jin-Woo doesn't fight like a devil hunter. He doesn't clash. He doesn't struggle. He doesn't escalate fear to overpower it. He ends things. In Jin-Woo's world, monsters didn't care if you were afraid. They killed you anyway. Fear never saved anyone. Winning did. That lesson carved itself into him, bone deep. So when Jin-Woo kills a devil, something unnatural happens. The devil doesn't empower hell. It doesn't echo back as legend or nightmare. It becomes experience. Strength stored. Authority reinforced. Shadows multiplied. Every victory stacks. Not emotionally. Systematically. A mid-tier devil, born from the fear of car accidents, ambushes Jin-Woo during a rainstorm. Civilians scatter. Fear spikes. Hell watches. This should be a feast. But the fight lasts 7 seconds. Jin-Woo doesn't let the devil roar. Doesn't let it terrify witnesses. A shadow blade decapitates it mid-lunge. And then, the devil's presence vanishes completely. No aftershock. No surge in fear-based strength elsewhere. Hell feels nothing. For the first time, a devil death gives hell no return. Reports pile up. Every devil killed by Jin-Woo reduces total fear output. Not temporarily. Permanently. Fear-based growth curves flatten. Some devils begin weakening despite increased media coverage. Fear is being generated. But it's not being absorbed. Someone in public safety writes a sentence that gets flagged immediately. The Shadow Monarch appears to intercept the fear feedback loop. Intercept. Like a parasite. Like a filter. Like a predator eating the ecosystem itself. Jin-Woo feels it too. After every battle, his shadows feel heavier. Denser. More complete. He doesn't need to rest. Doesn't need recovery. Victory doesn't exhaust him. It sharpens him. Every devil he kills becomes proof of concept. This world can be cleared. Like a dungeon. Low-level devils start fleeing on sight. Mid-tier devils stop hunting humans. High-tier devils begin avoiding entire regions. Fear spreads differently now. Not fear of devils. Fear for devils. Rumors circulate in hell. A hunter who doesn't feed us. A killer who doesn't echo. A king who keeps what he takes. Hell doesn't understand starvation. Until now. From her office, Makima studies the data. She doesn't need reports anymore. She sees patterns instinctively. Devils are not being recycled into fear. They're being removed from the system. And something else is growing instead. Not fear. Authority. Makima whispers, He feeds on winning. And for the first time, she recognizes a power source she cannot redirect. In hell, ancient devils feel something close to panic. Not fear, devils don't fear the same way humans do. But loss, territory shrinking, influence fading, names being forgotten. A devil erased by Chainsaw Man is forgotten by humanity. A devil killed by Jin-Woo is forgotten by hell. No reincarnation. No return. Just gone. Hell starts asking a question it never had to before. What if extinction is possible? On the surface, people notice something subtle. Cities feel calmer. Nightmares decrease. Children stop drawing monsters with too many teeth. Fear hasn't disappeared, but it no longer feels inevitable. And in that quiet, devils weaken further. Because fear without hopelessness doesn't feed them the same way. Jin-Woo stands on a rooftop, watching the city breathe. He's cleared dungeons before. He knows what happens when bosses realize the rules no longer favor them. They cheat. They escalate. They swarm. Hell will do the same. And when it does, he'll be ready. Because unlike devils, he doesn't need fear to grow. He just needs the next victory. Deep in hell, something ancient shifts. Not toward rage, toward preparation. Because hell finally understands the threat. This is not a hero reducing fear. This is a monarch reducing population. Devils grow stronger when feared. That's how the world has always worked. But Sung Jin-Woo obeys a different law. He grows stronger when he wins. And every devil he kills doesn't empower hell. It empowers him. For the first time since fear learned how to scream, hell is doing something new. It's counting losses and realizing too late that extinction is no longer impossible. In the world of Chainsaw Man, hell is not fire. It is not screaming rivers. It is not punishment. Hell is conceptual, a place where ideas take form. And the oldest ideas sit at the top. Fear lives here. And among all fears, darkness reigns. When Sung Jin-Woo crosses into hell, there is no explosion. No portal tearing reality apart. Just absence. Light does not fade. It is revoked. Sound does not echo. It is denied. This is hell's deepest layer, the domain where fear doesn't need shape anymore. Because everything already understands. Darkness is humanity's first fear. Before monsters. Before deaths. Before gods. The fear of not seeing what's coming. That fear gave birth to Darkness Devil. Not a devil who hunts. A devil who waits. Because everything eventually enters the dark. Hell reacts instantly. Not with alarms. With silence tightening. Because something has entered that does not belong. Sung Jin-Woo walks forward. No torch. No glow. No hesitation. His shadows stretch, but they do not disappear. They become clearer. Sharper, more defined than the darkness around them. That is wrong. Darkness does not allow definition. For the first time in uncountable ages, something ancient turns its attention. The Darkness Devil does not rush. It does not roar. It observes. Because this human walks as if the dark is familiar. As if it is not a threat. but territory. The darkness devil does not feel fear the way humans do, but it feels hierarchy. And something is off. This man does not weaken here. His heartbeat is steady. His presence does not shrink. In hell, humans break. Their minds fracture. Their shadows vanish. But Jin-Woo's shadow, it deepens. Darkness feeds on uncertainty, on the panic of not knowing what lurks just beyond sight. Jin-Woo does not wonder. He knows. He has cleared places darker than this. Dungeons where light never reached. Floors where monsters learned to hunt by sound alone. Darkness was never an enemy. It was cover. The darkness devil finally moves. Not toward Jin-Woo. Around him. The environment bends. Gravity misbehaves. Limbs of nothingness assemble and disassemble. A demonstration. This is my domain. Jin-Woo stops walking. Not in fear. In assessment. His shadows respond not by retreating, but by alignings. Formation. Order. Command. The darkness devil understands something then. This is not darkness given life. This is darkness given discipline. For the first time, the darkness devil does not feel curiosity. Not anger. Something colder. Calculation. Because Jin-Woo does not fear the dark. He does not worship it. He uses it. Darkness is not his master. It is his medium. Primal devils exist because fear is eternal. As long as humans exist, darkness will be feared. But Jin-Woo represents a flaw in that logic. Fear exists, yet he is unmoved. The darkness devil realizes the implication. If fear does not dominate him, then fear does not rule everything. And that possibility is unacceptable. They do not fight. Not yet. Ancient beings do not waste energy on uncertainty. Jin-Woo looks into the void. The void looks back. Two kings. One born from fear. One forged by victory. Other devils retreat. Lesser fears scatter. Hell feels smaller. Compressed. As if the dark itself is deciding whether to yield or escalate. The darkness devil remains still, because it understands something crucial. This human is not prey. He is not challenger. He is competition. As Jin-Woo turns away, continuing deeper into hell, the darkness devil makes its first mistake. It plans, because only threatened beings plan. Darkness has always been humanity's oldest fear. But Sung Jin-Woo does not fear the dark. He mastered it. And when the darkness devil finally noticed him, it wasn't with rage. It wasn't with curiosity. It was with the understanding that shook hell itself. For the first time since fear learned to hide in the shadows, the shadows no longer belonged to fear. They belonged to a king. In the world of Chainsaw Man, heroes are loud. They arrive with sirens, with speeches, with promises that everything will be okay. Heroes fight so people can keep believing tomorrow will come. Hunters are different. Hunters don't promise anything. They end things. Devils are used to heroes. They know the patterns. A devil appears. People scream. News cameras roll. Devil hunters charge in. The devil grows stronger from the panic. The battle escalates. Buildings fall. Even if the devil dies, it wins something. Fear always lingers. That's how devils stay immortal. That's how hell breathes. That's how the world has always worked. Until Sung Jin-Woo. It starts subtly. A city block where devils used to appear every week goes quiet. Then another. Then an entire ward. Public safety initially celebrates. Lower incident R. Lights. Fewer casualties. Better optics. But the veterans feel it. The silence isn't relief. It's avoidance. Low-level devils stop attacking crowds. They no longer burst into daylight. They no longer announce themselves. They stalk alleys, hide in basements, nest underground, because something worse than heroes is out there. A hunter who doesn't chase fear. He tracks existence. Sung Jin-Woo doesn't patrol. He hunts. No announcements. No witnesses. His shadows move ahead of him, scouting like a second consciousness. Devils don't even realize they've been found. One moment they exist. The next, they don't. No screams. No drawn-out fights. Just execution. Hunters don't fight monsters. They remove them from the map. Devils don't fear death. They fear irrelevance. A devil killed publicly becomes legend. A devil killed quietly becomes rumor. A devil killed by Jin-Woo becomes nothing. No fear echo. No rebirth momentum. Just absence. Devils start understanding the difference. Heroes make you famous. Hunters make you disappear. Civilians notice something strange. They're not bravers. They're calmer. The streets feel watched but not threatened. Fear hasn't vanished. It's relocated. From humans to devils. In hell, confusion spreads. Devils whisper. Why aren't humans panicking? Why aren't our names spreading? Why aren't we growing? Some devils grow reckless, trying to reclaim attention. They fail. Others grow cautious. They hide. Because hell was never designed to fight hunters. It was designed to farm fear. From her office, Makima watches the data distort. Lower fear yield. Lower devil manifestation rates. Higher permanent elimination ratios. She understands immediately. This isn't suppression. This is predation. Jin-Woo isn't saving people. He's teaching devils that existing has a cost. A final cost. Makima's fingers tighten slightly. Fear is losing its monopoly. A mid-tier devil born from the fear of urban legends senses him too late. It doesn't attack. It doesn't scream. It runs. That instinct alone is unprecedented. Devils were never meant to flee. The shadow overtakes it. No ceremony. No drama. The devil realizes, in its final moment, the cruelest truth of all. This human didn't hate it. Didn't fear it. Didn't even care. Public safety struggles to reframe Jin-Woo. Heroes inspire hope. Hunters inspire quiet. The media can't monetize him. There are no speeches. No heroic poses. No aftermath interviews. Just fewer devils. And that scares people in a different way. Because if devils can hide, they can be hunted. Jin-Woo understands this world now. Heroes belong to systems that want to preserve balance. Hunters exist to end systems that no longer work. Devils don't need reform. They need limits. And limits are enforced. Deep in hell, a realization spreads like frost. This human is not reducing fear. He's redirecting it. Away from humans. Toward devils. For the first time since fear learned to feed itself. Devils are afraid of being found. Heroes save people. Hunters erase threats. Heroes make monsters fight harder. Hunters make monsters hide. And as devils retreat into shadows they no longer own, one truth becomes undeniable. Fear has changed sides. And the world will never go back where Jin-Woo crosses a line even hell believed was impossible. Smiling crown. The alley reeked of blood and sulfur. Jin-Woo stood over the corpse of what the locals called a devil, a grotesque thing with too many limbs and a face that looked like it had been turned inside out. It had attacked a group of civilians near a convenience store, and Jin-Woo had put it down with minimal effort, one clean strike through what passed for its skull. The thing had crumpled like wet paper, its body already beginning to dissolve into ash and smoke, the way devils apparently did in this world when they died. Jin-Woo watched the dissipation process with quiet interest, his purple eyes tracking the way the flesh seemed to evaporate from the outside in. This world had its own rules, its own ecosystem of horror. Devils born from human fear, feeding on that same fear, dying when killed but potentially reincarnating in hell, only to return again. It was a cycle that reminded him of the dungeons back home, that endless spawn of monsters that humanity had learned to harvest and manage. But there was something different here, something that made his shadow pulse with an unfamiliar hunger. Jin-Woo tilted his head slightly, feeling that sensation intensify. His shadow stretched across the alley floor, darker than the surrounding darkness, moving with an awareness that had nothing to do with the flickering streetlight overhead. Since arriving in this world, he'd noticed his powers function normally, his stats were intact, his inventory accessible, his shadows obedient and deadly. He tested various abilities carefully, methodically, the way he always did when variables changed. But he hadn't tried this yet, hadn't attempted to extract a shadow from one of these. Devils, the thought had occurred to him, of course. It occurred to him with every creature he killed, an instinct as natural as breathing after all this time. But devils were different from monsters. They were concepts given flesh, fears made manifest. They had their own metaphysical rules, their own place in this world's order. Logic suggested that shadow extraction, a skill tied to his specific system, his specific power set, wouldn't work on entities so fundamentally different from the monsters of his home dimension. But Jin-Woo had long ago learned that logic was often just another limitation waiting to be broken. He knelt beside the dissolving corpse, placing one hand over where its heart would have been if it possessed normal anatomy. The flesh was cold and wrong beneath his palm, still solid enough to touch but fading fast. In another minute, maybe less, there would be nothing left but stains on the concrete. Closed his eyes, reaching not with his hand but with his will, with that core of shadow and authority that defined him as the Shadow Monarch. "Arise," he said softly, almost conversationally. The word hung in the air, nothing happened. The devil's body continued its dissolution, already half gone. Jin-Woo felt the familiar tug of extraction attempt to take hold, felt his power reaching out, and then felt it slide off, repelled by something fundamental in the devil's nature. He'd expected that, honestly. Different world, different rules. The system that governed his abilities might not have jurisdiction here over entities that existed outside its framework. But then something unexpected occurred. His shadow moved without his command, surging forward like a living thing, wrapping around the dissolving devil corpse with what could only be described as hunger. Jin-Woo's eyes snapped open, purple light flaring in his irises as he felt the shift. His shadow wasn't following system protocols. It was adapting, learning, evolving. It pressed into the devil's fading essence not as code executing a command, but as a predator claiming prey. The sensation was different from normal extraction, rawer and more primal. He could feel resistance, could feel the devil's nature trying to reject the intrusion, its metaphysical structure incompatible with the shadow's claim. But his authority as monarch wasn't just a system skill. It was something older, something that existed in the spaces between dimensional rules. It was dominion over death itself, over the boundary between existence and void. And this devil, for all its alien nature, was dead. That was the only permission his shadows needed. The air pressure dropped suddenly. The remaining fragments of the devil's body froze mid-dissolution, held in place by threads of darkness that emerged from Jin-Woo's shadow like surgical instruments. He didn't force it, didn't try to overpower the resistance. Instead, he understood it, reading the devil's essential nature the way he might read a particularly complex dungeon boss pattern. This creature was born from the fear of insects, he realized, specifically the fear of things that crawled and swarmed and invaded personal space. Its existence was tied to that primal human revulsion, that instinctive recoil from chitinous legs and mandibles. It wasn't just a monster wearing a shape. It was the shape that fear took. Jin-Woo smiled slightly. Fear and death weren't so different, really. Both were shadows that humanity carried, constants that transcended dimensional boundaries. If devils were fear given form, and his shadows were death given purpose, then perhaps the incompatibility wasn't as absolute as it first appeared. He spoke the command again, but this time he poured his full authority into it, not as a system skill, but as a declaration of sovereignty. Arise. The word resonated with power that made the shadows in the alley deepen and stretch. The devil's corpse convulsed. Black smoke poured from its dissolving flesh, but instead of dissipating into the air, the smoke was drawn downward, pulled into Jin-Woo's shadow with inexorable force. The resistance he'd felt before shattered like glass, and suddenly the extraction wasn't difficult at all, it was inevitable. The devil's essence, its fundamental nature as a being born from fear, was consumed by something older and more absolute. Death claimed fear, shadow claimed form, and from Jin-Woo's shadow something began to rise. It emerged slowly, pulling itself up from the two-dimensional plane as if climbing from deep water. Black smoke coalesced into solid shadow, and the devil was reborn, not as it had been, but as something new. Its insected form remained, but now it was composed entirely of darkness, its edges sharp and defined against reality itself. Purple flames flickered in the empty sockets where its eyes had been, the signature mark of Jin-Woo's soldiers. It stood on too many legs, mandibles clicking silently, but there was no malice in its posture now, no hunger, Anil. Why obedience? The shadow devil turned its eyeless gaze toward Jin-Woo and lowered its head in a gesture of submission so natural it might have been instinct. Jin-Woo stood, studying his newest soldier with analytical interest. He could feel it in his consciousness now, a new thread in the vast network of his shadow army, but it felt different from his other soldiers. There was an additional quality to it, a resonance that marked it as something more than just a reanimated monster. This had been a devil, a creature of concept and fear, and now it was his. He tested the connection, sending a simple command through their link. The shadow devil responded instantly, scuttling up the alley wall with disturbing speed before dropping back down and settling into a waiting position. Its movements were fluid and precise, no different from any of his elite soldiers. Jin-Woo nodded slowly, processing the implications. Shadow extraction worked on devils. The system, or perhaps more accurately, his authority as monarch, could override whatever metaphysical laws governed these creatures. That changed everything. In his world, he'd built an army from the monsters that threatened humanity, turning their own weapons against them. He could do the same here. Every devil he killed could become a soldier. Every concept made flesh could be claimed and repurposed. The cycle of devils dying and reincarnating in hell wouldn't apply to those he extracted. Once claimed by Shadow, they belonged to death permanently. The Shadow Devil had died in fear, Jin-Woo realized. He'd seen it in those final moments before his strike landed, recognition of its own mortality, terror at facing something it couldn't categorize or resist. How ironic that a creature born from humanity's fear of insects had experienced its own fear and death, and now that fear had been transformed into absolute silence and obedience. It would never feel fear again, never feel anything except his will directing its purpose. Jin-Woo dismissed the Shadow Devil with a gesture, watching it dissolve back into his shadow to join the countless others waiting there. He could sense them all, his army of darkness that stretched across dimensions and numbered in the tens of thousands. And now that number would grow with an entirely new category of soldier. Devils extracted from this world's unique ecosystem, concepts given form, and then remade as instruments of his will. He turned and began walking out of the alley, his shadow trailing behind him in a way that seemed just slightly wrong, slightly too eager. This discovery opened new possibilities, new strategies for navigating this world's dangers. The devil hunters who operated here were brave and skilled, but they were fundamentally limited by mortality and resource scarcity. They could kill devils, but those devils would eventually return. They could contain threats, but never permanently eliminate them. Jinwoo's shadows offered something different: true death, final extraction, the permanent removal of a devil from the cycle of existence. That made him potentially the most dangerous entity in this entire world, more threatening than any primal fear, any weapon, any contract-bound devil, because he didn't just kill, he recruited. The implications for the power structures of this world would be significant, Jin-Woo thought as he emerged onto the main street. Public safety, the various devil hunter organizations, the international power balance maintained through controlled violence and necessary evils, all of it operated on the assumption that devils were a permanent fixture, a renewable resource of horror that could be managed but never eliminated. What would they do when they learned that assumption was false? When they discovered that someone could permanently remove devils from existence, or worse, turn them into an army that answered to no government or oversight, Jin-Woo had no particular interest in ruling or reshaping this world's political landscape, but he understood enough about human nature to know that his mere existence here represented a threat to established systems. People in power rarely responded well to variables they couldn't control. His phone buzzed, a cheap burner he'd acquired after arriving in this world, a message from one of his monitoring programs, tracking news and public incidents. Another devil attack on the other side of the city, a bigger one this time. Multiple casualties reported, devil hunters en route. Jin-Woo glanced at the message, then at his shadow stretching ahead of him on the sidewalk, slightly darker and more substantial than any natural shadow should be. He thought about the shadow devil now dwelling there, about the army he could build from this world's fears made manifest. A devil that died in fear now fought in silence. It was poetic in a way and deeply practical. He started walking toward the reported attack, his pace unhurried but purposeful. If shadow extraction worked on devils, then very fight was an opportunity. Every crisis was a recruitment drive. The Shadow Monarch had arrived in a world that thought it understood horror, that had built entire civilizations around managing and surviving fear given form. They had no idea what was coming, what had already arrived. Jin-Woo's smile was slight and cold as he walked, his shadow stretching long behind him, and within that shadow, an army waited in patient, eternal silence. The encounter happened in a place between places, in one of those quiet moments that Tokyo occasionally offered despite its constant chaos. Jin-Woo had been tracking a devil's signature through the industrial district when he felt it, a presence that made his shadow ripple with something that wasn't quite alarm, but wasn't comfort either. It was recognition. The kind of recognition that came from standing in the presence of something fundamentally similar to yourself, like a mirror reflecting not your appearance but your essential nature. He'd stopped walking, standing perfectly still in an empty lot littered with rusted machinery and dead weeds pushing through cracked concrete. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost too vivid, too deliberate, like reality was setting a stage. And then he saw it, a small orange dog with a chainsaw blade protruding from its head, walking around the corner of a corrugated metal warehouse with an unnatural silence that marked it as something far more than it appeared. The dog stopped when it saw Jin-Woo. There was no surprise in its posture, no startled freeze or territorial aggression. It simply stopped and looked at him with dark eyes that held an awareness that transcended animal intelligence. Jin-Woo looked back, his expression neutral but his senses fully engaged, reading the creature the way he'd learned to read threats and powers across two worlds now. This wasn't a normal devil. The signature was wrong, too dense, too layered, like looking at a star and realizing you were actually seeing a collapsed galaxy compressed into a single point of light. This small, harmless-looking dog with a chainsaw for a head radiated power that made some of Jin-Woo's strongest shadows stir restlessly in the space between dimensions. Not with hostility, but with the kind of attention that apex predators gave each other when sharing territory. A mutual acknowledgement of capability and danger. Pachita because Jin-Woo somehow knew that was its name, the same way you sometimes just know things about entities that exist on certain levels of reality, took a few steps closer. Not aggressive steps, not hesitant ones either. Just movement with purpose, closing distance in a way that suggested curiosity rather than threat. The chainsaw blade on its head didn't rev or spin. The dog didn't growl or bare teeth. It simply approached Jin-Woo the way one ancient thing might approach another, with the understanding that certain beings existed outside the normal hierarchy of predator and prey. Jin-Woo remained still, watching, analyzing. He could kill this creature if necessary. He was confident in that assessment, even with the immense power he could sense coiled within that small form. But he was also curious. Because unlike every other devil he'd encountered in this world, This one wasn't radiating malice or hunger, or even the blind instinct to fulfill its nature. It was radiating something else entirely, something that felt almost like comprehension. The dog sat down about 10 feet away from him, tilting its head in that universal canine gesture of curiosity. The chainsaw blade moved with the tilt, catching the dying light. Jin-Woo studied the creature, his mind working through the implications. He'd learned enough about this world to understand the basic categories: devils born from fears, ranked by the terror they inspired, some more powerful than others. But this felt different. This felt like something that predated categories, that existed in the foundation of this world's reality, the way he existed in the foundation of his own. A pillar, perhaps, or a cornerstone, something essential that everything else was built around, whether they knew it or not. Jin-Woo had been something like that once in his own world. The Shadow Monarch, the final authority over death and darkness, the ending point of a system that had governed reality for longer than human civilization. He'd inherited that mantle through violence and survival, through dying and refusing to stay dead, through walking into annihilation and coming back with its power as his own. And looking at this small dog with impossible power compressed into a deceptively harmless form, Jin-Woo recognized the same pattern. This creature had survived something that should have been absolute, had walked through its own annihilation and kept existing. The scars of that survival were written in the fundamental structure of its being, visible to anyone who knew how to read such things. Pachita didn't bark, didn't make any sound at all, actually. Just sat there looking at Jin-Woo with those dark eyes that held depths Jin-Woo could sense but not fully measure. And slowly, deliberately, the dog's tail began to wag, not frantically, not with the simple joy of an animal seeing a potential friend. This was measured, controlled, almost formal, a gesture of acknowledgement. Jin-Woo felt something in his chest shift, tension he hadn't fully registered releasing. His shadow, which had been coiled tight and ready, relaxed slightly, still vigilant, still prepared, but no longer poised on the edge of violence. He took a step forward. Pachita's tail continued its slow, measured wag. Another step. The dog remained seated, perfectly calm, radiating that same sense of understanding that had marked their interaction from the beginning. Jin-Woo closed the distance until he was standing directly in front of the creature, close enough to reach out and touch it if he chose to. This close, the power was even more apparent, not oppressive, but present the way gravity was present, fundamental and unavoidable. He knelt down slowly, bringing himself to eye level with the dog. Pachita's tail stopped wagging, but not in a threatening way. The creature simply became still, giving Jin-Woo its full attention with an intensity that most beings would have found uncomfortable or frightening. But Jin-Woo had stared into the abyss of his own death, had bargained with entities that existed beyond mortality, had walked through halls where concepts died and were reborn. An intense stare from a powerful being was just another Tuesday. "You know what I am," Jin-Woo said softly. It wasn't a question. Pachita's head tilted again, this time in the other direction, and Jin-Woo could have sworn he saw understanding flicker in those dark eyes. Not human understanding, not the comprehension that came from language and culture, but something older and more essential. The recognition that existed between survivors of impossible things, between beings who had touched annihilation and been forever marked by it. Jin-Woo had met powerful entities before the monarchs, the rulers, beings of immense power and cosmic significance. But most of them had been born into their power, had inherited it or been created with it as an essential part of their nature. They'd never known weakness, never experienced the transition from mortal vulnerability to transcendent capability. They didn't understand what it meant to survive the unsurvivable, to die and come back wrong in ways that made you more than you were, but cost you parts of yourself you could never recover. Pachita understood. Jin-Woo could see it in the way the dog held itself, in the quality of its silence, in the absolute absence of fear despite being in the presence of something that could potentially end its existence. This was a creature that had already ended once, had already walked through whatever annihilation looked like in this world, and had emerged on the other side as something new. Something that wore the shape of a small dog with a chainsaw blade, but was actually a door to something much larger and more terrifying. Jin-Woo knew about being doors, about containing multitudes behind a human-shaped facade, about walking through the world as something that looked mostly normal, while carrying inside yourself the weight of armies and authorities that could reshape reality if fully unleashed. It was lonely, sometimes. Not in a way that made him seek companionship or connection, but in the fundamental isolation that came from existing on a different level than almost everything around you. Even among his shadows, even surrounded by his army, there was a distance that came from being the monarch rather than the soldier, the one who commanded rather than obeyed, the ending point rather than a step along the way. And here was this dog, this impossible creature, looking at him with eyes that said, "I know what you are because I am the same." Not the same in specifics. Their powers were different, their origins divergent, their purposes likely incompatible on paper, but the same in the way that mattered. Both survivors, both walkers in the space beyond death, both things that should not exist but do anyway, stubbornly persisting despite logic and nature and the universe's apparent preference for their absence. Pachita made a sound then, soft and low. Not quite a whine, not quite a rumble. Something that lived in the space between comfort and warning, between greeting and goodbye. Jin-Woo found himself reaching out slowly, giving the creature every opportunity to move away if it chose. His hand extended, palm down, the universal gesture of peaceful approach that transcended species and dimensions. Pachita leaned forward, closing the remaining distance, and pressed the top of its head against Jin-Woo's palm. Not the chainsaw blade that angled away carefully, deliberately. Just the soft fur between its ears, warm and surprisingly normal feeling despite everything else about this creature that was abnormal. The contact created a circuit, a connection that went deeper than physical touch. For just a moment, Jin-Woo could sense the vast thing that existed beneath Pachita's surface, could feel the echo of chainsaws cutting through reality itself, the memory of battles that had reshaped this world's fundamental nature, the weight of a power so immense that reality had to compress it down into this small, manageable form just to contain it without breaking. And he knew, without words or explanation, that Pachita was sensing the same thing from him in reverse. The endless shadow army waiting in the spaces between moments. The authority over death that extended across dimensions. The cold certainty of someone who had stood at the end of everything and decided that the end was just another beginning. They understood each other in that moment with perfect clarity. Two beings who had survived annihilation and kept walking. Two entities who existed as doors to apocalypses that most people would never see or understand. Two survivors who knew what it meant to carry impossible weight with casual grace, to be the friendly face in front of the cosmic horror. Jin-Woo pulled his hand back after a moment, and Pachita sat back down, tail resuming that slow, measured wag. There was no need for more communication. Everything that needed to be said had been said in that moment of contact, in that exchange of recognition and respect. Jin-Woo stood and Pachita stood as well, both of them returning to their respective guard positions, relaxed but ready, calm but aware. They weren't allies exactly, weren't friends in any conventional sense, but they were something. 2 points of absolute power in a world that tried to pretend such things could be managed and controlled and understood. 2 survivals that defied categorization. Jin-Woo glanced at the sky, noting that full darkness had fallen while they'd been locked in their silent communication. Time had moved strangely during that exchange, the way it sometimes did when things that existed outside normal time intersected with the mundane world. "You're not going to attack me," Jin-Woo observed, still speaking softly, almost conversationally. Pachita's tail wagged once, twice, then stopped. The dog turned and began walking away, back toward wherever it had come from, moving with that same unnatural silence. But before it disappeared around the corner of the warehouse, it paused and looked back over its shoulder. Those dark eyes met Jin-Woo's purple ones one more time, and in that gaze was an entire conversation. "You understand the weight. You carry the same burden. We are the same kind of lonely. You and I, the kind that comes from being the last of something, or the first, or the only." Then Pachita was gone, vanished into the shadows between buildings with the quiet grace of something that had never really been fully there to begin with. Jin-Woo stood in the empty lot for a long moment, processing the encounter. His shadow had returned to its normal state, neither aggressive nor particularly reactive. Even his soldiers seemed content, as if they'd recognized in Pachita a fellow instrument of absolute force rather than a threat to be eliminated. Jin-Woo smiled slightly, the expression genuine if brief. In a world full of devils born from fear and humans struggling to survive them, he'd just met something entirely different. Something that wasn't afraid of him despite every reason to be, because it had walked the same path he had, survived the same impossible survival. Pachita wasn't afraid because fear required not understanding the threat, and Pachita understood perfectly. Understood and respected the boundaries that such understanding created. 2 beings of annihilation, acknowledging each other's territory and choosing not to contest it. Not out of fear, but out of the respect that only equals could offer each other. Jin-Woo turned and resumed his own path through the industrial district, his shadow stretching long in the streetlights, his army silent within it. Somewhere in this city, a small orange dog with a chainsaw for a head was walking its own path, carrying its own impossible burden. and for just a moment, that burden had been a little lighter because someone else understood what it meant to carry it. Two survivors who had kept walking when annihilation told them to stop. Two beings who existed as proof that the end was never really the end. Jin-Woo felt oddly at peace as he walked, more settled in this strange world than he had been since arriving. Pachita had given him something unexpected, not friendship, not alliance, but recognition. And sometimes, for beings like them, recognition was more valuable than any power or advantage. It was proof that you weren't just a monster wearing a familiar shape. You were a survivor who had earned the right to keep existing, to keep walking, to keep carrying your impossible weight with dignity. And somewhere in this city of fear and chainsaws and devils, that recognition mattered more than all the power either of them possessed. Makima sat in her office on the top floor of the public safety headquarters, hands folded neatly on her desk, golden-ringed eyes focused on the stack of reports in front of her, with an intensity that might have seemed like ordinary. Why concentration to anyone who didn't know better? But Makima never simply concentrated. Every expression, every gesture, every moment of apparent casualness was calculated and intentional, part of a performance so flawless that it had become indistinguishable from genuine behavior. She was reading about him again. The anomaly, the variable that had appeared in her carefully ordered world 3 weeks ago and refused to fit into any category she understood, Sung Jin-Woo. A foreign devil hunter, according to the cover story that had been hastily constructed by intelligence assets scrambling to explain his presence and capabilities. Except Makima knew he wasn't a devil hunter, wasn't foreign in any conventional sense, and possibly wasn't even human despite wearing a human shape with convincing accuracy. She'd identified him as a problem within 48 hours of his arrival. Had recognized within 72 hours that he represented a threat to her plans on a fundamental level, and had spent the past 2.5 weeks conducting surveillance, gathering data, and slowly coming to a conclusion that troubled her more than she cared to admit. The reports were thorough, compiled from multiple sources: public safety observers, satellite footage, testimony from civilians and devil hunters who'd encountered him, even data purchased from private intelligence brokers who operated in Tokyo's underworld. Every report told the same story with slight variations. Jin-Woo appeared at devil attack sites, eliminated threats with efficiency that bordered on casual, and then disappeared before official response teams arrived. He worked alone, never requested support or backup, never filed paperwork or sought authorization. He existed entirely outside the systems that Makima had spent years infiltrating and controlling, operating with complete autonomy in a world that she'd carefully designed to funnel all significant power through channels she could monitor and manipulate. That alone would have marked him as a priority target, but it was the how of his operations that truly concerned her. Jin-Woo didn't make contracts with devils, didn't rely on weapons or human allies, didn't show fear or hesitation or any of the normal human weaknesses that Makima had learned to exploit over her long existence. Instead, he commanded shadows. Literal shadows that emerged from darkness and tore devils apart with mechanical precision, or consumed them entirely, or sometimes. And this was the part that made Makima's perfect composure slip just slightly when she'd first read about it, extracted their essences, and added them to some kind of army that he carried with him always. She'd watched footage of one such extraction, recorded by a security camera in an alley where Jin-Woo had killed a mid-tier devil. The video quality was poor, the angles suboptimal, but Makima's eyes were more than human, and she could see what the camera had barely captured. She'd watched him kneel beside the dissolving devil corpse, watched his shadow spread and darken and move with predatory hunger, watched something impossible happen as the devil was pulled down into that darkness, and then re-emerged as a soldier made of shadow and purple flame. A devil that had died was made to serve, not through contract or coercion, not through fear or manipulation, but through absolute dominion over death itself. Makima had rewound that footage 17 times, studying every frame, and each viewing had reinforced the same conclusion. Jin-Woo possessed an authority that operated on a level similar to her own. Not identical, his power seemed to be oriented around death and darkness, where hers was oriented around control and domination, but equivalent in scope and absolute in application. That made him dangerous in a way that transcended normal threat assessment. Makima's power as the control devil was fundamentally based on hierarchy, on chains of command, on the principle that everything could be controlled if you understood the right pressure points and possessed sufficient authority to exploit them. She controlled humans through their social contracts and their need for order. She controlled devils through their fear of her and the contracts she'd established. She controlled fate itself through carefully laid plans and the accumulated weight of centuries of manipulation. But Jin-Woo didn't fit into any hierarchy she could access. He had no contracts to exploit, no fears she could manipulate, no social connections she could use as leverage. He was in the most fundamental sense independent, self-sufficient, a closed system that operated according to its own internal logic without requiring or acknowledging external authority. Makima's perfect world, the world she was carefully constructing through blood and manipulation and the strategic elimination of obstacles, was built on the principle of total control. Every piece in its proper place, every variable accounted for, every potential threat either converted into a tool or removed entirely. She envisioned a world without fear, without chaos, without the randomness that made human existence so messy and inefficient. A world where devils served their purpose in her grand design, where humans lived in structured harmony under her benevolent guidance, where even death itself was just another mechanism to be managed and directed. It was a beautiful vision, one she'd been working toward for longer than most nations had existed, and it required control. Absolute, total, uncompromising control over every significant variable. Jin-Woo represented something worse than chaos. Chaos could be managed, could be channeled and directed and eventually brought to heel. She'd done it countless times, turning chaotic elements into useful tools through patience and strategic pressure. But Jin-Woo wasn't chaotic. He was orderly, methodical, precise in his actions, and consistent in his patterns. The problem was that his order operated entirely independently of hers. He was a second center of gravity in a system that her plans required to have only one gravitational well, herself. Every action he took, every devil he killed and extracted, every time he operated outside her oversight, he demonstrated that her control was not total, that there were forces in the world that didn't acknowledge her authority, that couldn't be bent to her will through conventional means. Makima closed the topmost report and opened another, this one containing psychological analysis compiled by her best profilers. They'd done their work based on limited data, constructing a personality profile from observed behaviors and secondhand accounts. The profile painted a picture of someone who was calm, rational, and dangerously competent. Someone who valued efficiency and results over recognition or social connection. Someone who had killed so many times that violence had become routine, unremarkable, just another tool to be applied when circumstances required it. The profilers had flagged him as a potential sociopath, but Makima dismissed that assessment immediately. Jin-Woo wasn't lacking in empathy. She'd seen footage of him helping civilians, moving them out of danger zones before engaging threats. He simply had the emotional distance that came from experiencing things that put normal human concerns into perspective. She recognized it because she possessed a similar quality herself, though for different reasons. Jin-Woo had survived something that broke him and remade him stronger. Makima had never been human enough to break in the first place. The analysis concluded with a recommendation: establish contact, attempt recruitment, assess potential for control through standard means. If standard means failed, escalate to contracts and coercion. If that failed, eliminate the target as a threat to operational security. Makima had read that recommendation and immediately recognized its inadequacy. The profilers didn't understand what Jin-Woo was because they were thinking in conventional terms, treating him as an unusually powerful devil hunter who might be brought into public safety structure through normal channels. But Makima understood. She'd seen enough, analyzed enough, extrapolated enough from the available data. Jin-Woo wasn't a devil hunter. He was something that existed outside this world's normal categories entirely, operating according to rules that predated or superseded the fear devil ecosystem that defined reality here. He was a sovereign entity wearing human skin, an absolute authority condensed into a single person, a living proof that control could never be total, because there would always be something beyond the reach of even the longest chain of command. She could try to recruit him, certainly, could approach him with offers of cooperation, resources, integration into her organization. But Makima was nothing if not realistic about her capabilities and limitations. Jin-Woo would see through any attempt at manipulation immediately because manipulation required the target to have desires or fears that could be exploited, and Jin-Woo had already demonstrated that he operated beyond such considerations. He didn't want power, he possessed absolute power already. He didn't want recognition, he actively avoided attention. He didn't fear death, he commanded it. Every lever that Makima normally used to move people would find no purchase on someone who existed as a completely self-contained system. She could try to control him directly, using her authority as the control devil to simply override his will and force obedience. But that thought made her pause, made her golden eyes narrow slightly as she considered the probable outcome. Her control worked by establishing hierarchy, by making the target acknowledge, consciously or unconsciously, that she held authority over them. It worked on humans because humans were social creatures who understood hierarchy instinctively. It worked on devils because devils were born from human fears and thus carried human conceptual frameworks in their essential nature. But Jin-Woo had shown no indication that he acknowledged any hierarchy that included him as anything other than the absolute top. His shadows obeyed him with perfect loyalty. His power answered only to his will. Even his interaction with Pachita and Makima had been very interested to learn about that encounter, had paid substantial sums to obtain footage and testimony from the few witnesses who'd noticed it, had been one of equals acknowledging each other rather than superior and subordinate establishing pecking order. If she tried to control Jin-Woo directly and failed, she would reveal the limits of her power to someone who was already a significant threat. If she succeeded, she would gain a powerful tool, but also establish that her control could reach him, which would likely prompt him to take measures to remove himself from her reach permanently. Either outcome was problematic. The optimal solution, Makima concluded with the cold logic that had served her for centuries, was removal. Not elimination in the sense of killing. She wasn't certain that was even possible, and attempting it would certainly provoke a response that might destabilize her other plans. But removal from the equation, displacement to somewhere that his independence couldn't interfere with her control. Jin-Woo had appeared in this world somehow, which meant travel between dimensions or realities was possible. If he could come here, he could presumably be sent elsewhere, or contained in a space where his power couldn't affect her operations, or simply avoided while she accelerated her plans to completion, creating her perfect world fast enough that his presence became irrelevant. All of those options required more information and more resources than she currently had access to, but Makima was patient. She'd been patient for centuries. She could be patient a little longer while she gathered the pieces she needed to remove this particular obstacle. The thought of Jin-Woo existing in her perfect world was genuinely unpalatable. That world required control, total and absolute, with every element serving its proper function in her grand design. Jin-Woo would never serve. Would never acknowledge her authority. Would always represent a center of independent power that could, at any moment, decide to oppose her plans for reasons of his own. Even if he never actively opposed her, even if he simply continued doing whatever it was he was doing in this world, his mere existence would be a constant reminder that her control was incomplete, that there were things beyond her reach, that perfection had flaws. Makima found that thought intolerable. Her perfect world had no place for someone like Jin-Woo, no room for absolute independence in a system built on total control. He would have to disappear. Not immediately, she wasn't ready to make that move yet, didn't have the pieces in place. But eventually, inevitably, one way or another, Jin-Woo would need to be removed from the board before she could complete her grand design. Makima stood from her desk, moving to the window that overlooked Tokyo's sprawling cityscape. Somewhere out there, Jin-Woo was walking through her city, operating in her territory, existing as a living refutation of her authority. The thought would have made her angry if she were capable of genuine anger. Instead, it simply registered as a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be removed, a variable to be eliminated from the equation. She would smile at him when they finally met properly, would offer cooperation and resources and all the pretty lies that humans wanted to hear, would probe gently for weaknesses and pressure points and possible avenues of control. And when she'd gathered enough information, when she'd prepared the right circumstances and assembled the right pieces, she would remove him from her world with the same calm efficiency she applied to all obstacles, not out of hatred or fear, but out of necessity. Because her perfect world required perfection, and perfection could not accommodate the existence of something that refused to be controlled. Makima's reflection in the window glass stared back at her with golden-ringed eyes that held no emotion, no warmth, no humanity, just cold calculation and infinite patience. Jin-Woo was powerful, certainly, possibly even more powerful than her in direct confrontation, though she'd need more data to be certain of that assessment. But power was only one variable among many. And Makima had spent centuries learning how to defeat things more powerful than herself by controlling the context in which power was applied. Jin-Woo might command death and shadows, might possess an army that numbered in the tens of thousands, might have survived annihilation and walked back stronger, but Makima commanded fate itself, shaped reality through accumulated manipulation and strategic patience, and had successfully opposed entities that most humans couldn't even conceptualize. One way or another, her perfect world would come into being, and when it did, there would be no place in it for the Shadow Monarch. No room for absolute independence in a reality built on chains of control, extending infinitely in all directions with her at the eternal center. Makima turned away from the window, already mentally compiling the next steps. More surveillance, deeper analysis, careful probing for weaknesses. She had time, she had resources, she had centuries of experience manipulating reality to serve her will, and she had something Jin-Woo might not have, the absolute certainty that came from existing as a concept made flesh, as control given form and purpose. He would disappear. One way or another, he would be removed from the world she was creating. Because in Makima's perfect world, there could only be one authority, one center, one will that shaped reality, and that will was hers, always had been, always would be. Jin-Woo's independence, impressive and absolute as it was, would ultimately mean nothing against the accumulated weight of her control. He just didn't know it yet. Jin-Woo's first descent into hell happened by accident, though calling it an accident didn't quite capture the inevitability of it. He'd been fighting a devil that possessed some kind of spatial manipulation ability, something that twisted reality around itself like crumpled paper. The fight had been brief, most of his fights were these days, but in its final moments, as his shadows tore through the devil's defense and his hand closed around what passed for its throat, the creature had made one last desperate attempt to escape. It had opened a door, a rip in space that led somewhere else, somewhere that reeked of sulfur and despair, and something else Jin-Woo couldn't immediately identify. The devil had tried to flee through that door. Jin-Woo had simply followed, dragging the creature with him through the tear in reality, because letting prey escape was inefficient, and he'd learned long ago that loose ends had a way of becoming problems later. The transition was instantaneous and disorienting, in a way that reminded him of entering high-level dungeons back in his own world. That momentary sensation of reality reshuffling itself around you, of crossing a threshold between one set of physical laws and another. He'd emerged in hell still gripping the devil's throat, and had killed it within seconds of arrival, his shadows spreading out automatically to secure the perimeter while he assessed his new environment. Hell, it turned out, looked exactly like its name suggested, and nothing like the organized dungeon structures Jin-Woo was familiar with. The sky was a roiling mass of red and black, lit by lightning that seemed to arc between dimensions rather than clouds. The ground was a wasteland of ash and bone, stretching out in all directions toward horizons that seemed too close and too far away simultaneously. And everywhere were devils, not attacking, not initially, just existing, staring at him with countless eyes from countless malformed bodies, radiating surprise and hostility in equal measure. Jin-Woo had stood there for a long moment, processing. Hell, the place where devils were reborn after being killed in the human world. The realm that existed as a parallel to reality, where concepts and fears lived in their purest, most distilled forms. He'd heard about it from the intelligence he'd gathered, understood it as an abstract concept. But standing in it, feeling the weight of the place pressing against his senses, he realized something important. Hell wasn't just another dimension. It was a system. Not a system in the way his own powers were a system, with clear levels and progression and quantifiable rewards, but a system nonetheless, a structure with rules and hierarchies and consistent patterns that governed how things functioned. Devils died in the human world and were reborn here, lived here for some period, regaining strength and form, then returned to the human world through various means, continuing the cycle. It was inefficient, certainly, chaotic and unpredictable in ways that would have made any dungeon designer back in his world weep with frustration. But underneath the chaos was structure, layers of reality stacked on top of each other, territories controlled by stronger devils, resources and power concentrated in specific locations. It was, Jin-Woo realized with something approaching amusement, remarkably similar to a poorly designed dungeon, and Jin-Woo had cleared thousands of dungeons. The devils nearest to him had started to recover from their surprise, beginning to approach with obvious hostile intent. Jin-Woo's shadow exploded outward in response, his army emerging all at once in a display of force that turned the ash-covered ground black with overlapping shadows. Thousands of soldiers materialized in seconds, creating a perimeter of silent, lethal obedience around their monarch. The approaching devils stopped immediately, whatever passed for survival instinct in their alien minds suddenly screaming warnings. They were looking at an army that numbered in the tens of thousands, soldiers ranging from low-tier shadow beasts to elite warriors that radiated power comparable to primal devils. And standing at the center of that army, perfectly calm and utterly unintimidated by finding himself in literal hell, was Jin-Woo. He'd made a decision in that moment, one that would have seemed insane to anyone who didn't understand how his mind worked. He wasn't going to try to escape hell, wasn't going to search for a way back immediately. Instead, he was going to do what he always did when confronted with a system that could be understood and exploited. He was going to clear it, systematically, methodically, floor by floor if hell had floors, territory by territory if it didn't. He would map the structure, identify the bosses, eliminate the threats, and extract anything useful for his army. Hell was just another dungeon, and Jin-Woo was very, very good at clearing dungeons. The first floor of hell, as Jin-Woo had mentally categorized it, was the wasteland where he'd arrived. It was populated by weak devils, the kind that died quickly in the human world and respawned here with minimal power. They attacked him in waves once they'd overcome their initial shock at his presence, driven by instinct and hunger rather than strategy. Jin-Woo had cleared them efficiently, his shadows spreading out in formation patterns he'd refined over years of dungeon raids. Each devil killed was evaluated for extraction potential. Most weren't worth the effort, too weak, too unstable, too limited in capability. But some met his standards and were added to his army, their essence consumed by shadow and remade as obedient soldiers. Within 6 hours, by his internal clock, time seemed to flow strangely in hell, but his system still tracked it accurately. He'd cleared the wasteland entirely. Every devil in the region was either dead, extracted, or had fled to deeper layers. Jin-Woo had stood at the center of a field of ash and dissolving corpses, his shadow army arranged around him in perfect order, and had looked toward what his senses identified as the next layer down. Deeper, that was always how dungeons worked. Power increased with depth. The real threats were never on the surface. Jin-Woo had walked forward, his army flowing with him like a tide of darkness, and had crossed into the second layer. This one was different, a forest of bones that grew from the ground like trees, their branches hung with what looked like screaming faces frozen in various expressions of agony. The devils here were stronger, more organized, possessing actual hunting strategies and group tactics. Jin-Woo had cleared them anyway. The pattern repeated as he descended. Third layer, a city of rust and decay inhabited by devils that had once been human fears of urban isolation and industrial horror. Fourth layer, an ocean of blood where aquatic devils swam in formations that suggested military organization. Fifth layer, a maze of mirrors that reflected not appearances but sins and regrets, guarded by devils that fed on guilt and shame. Jin-Woo cleared them all. Each layer took longer than the last as the devils grew stronger and more intelligent. But none of them could stand against an army that numbered in the tens of thousands and was commanded by someone who had centuries of tactical experience compressed into a few years of constant combat. By the time Jin-Woo reached what he identified as the 10th layer, he'd been in hell for what his system calculated as 3 days. He'd killed thousands of devils and extracted hundreds that met his standards. His army had grown larger and more diverse, now including entities that represented fears and concepts unique to this dimension. And he'd started to understand hell's structure with the kind of intimate knowledge that only came from systematic exploration and exploitation. Hell wasn't infinite, he'd discovered. It had boundaries and limits, even if those limits were vast beyond easy comprehension. It was organized in rough layers or floors, with power and danger increasing as you descended. And at certain depths, there were what Jin-Woo had started calling bosses, individual devils of immense power that controlled territories and commanded lesser devils in rough hierarchies. The first boss he'd encountered was on the 12th layer, a massive devil that embodied the fear of natural disasters. It had attacked with the force of hurricanes and earthquakes, reshaping the battlefield itself to its advantage. Jin-Woo had killed it in 47 seconds, his most powerful shadows pinning it in place while he'd personally delivered the finishing blow. Then he'd extracted it, adding a disaster-class devil to his army as casually as someone might collect a rare drop from a dungeon boss. The pattern continued, layer after layer, boss after boss. Jin-Woo descended through hell with methodical precision, clearing each level completely before moving to the next. His shadows mapped every territory, cataloged every devil type, identified every resource and strategic position. He wasn't just fighting his way through hell, he was understanding it, dissecting its structure and function the way a surgeon might dissect an organism to understand its anatomy. By the 20th layer, Jin-Woo had started to notice something interesting. Hell was responding to his presence. not with intelligence, exactly, but with the kind of systemic adjustment that dungeons back in his world had shown when faced with sufficiently powerful raiders. Devils were avoiding areas where his army had passed. Territories were reorganizing, power structures shifting as weaker devils fled deeper and stronger ones moved up to confront the threat. Hell itself seemed to recognize him as an invasive element, something that didn't belong in its ecosystem, and was trying to mount a response. Jin-Woo found it fascinating in an academic way. Hell was alive after a fashion, not conscious in any conventional sense, but possessing an emergent intelligence that arose from the collective behavior of all the devils within it. It was learning, adapting, trying to develop countermeasures. It wouldn't be enough. By the 30th layer, Jin-Woo had encountered what he thought of as the Devil Kings, entities of such immense power that they functioned as pillars of Hell's structure itself. Primal devils and their equivalents, beings that represented fundamental human fears and possessed authority over entire domains of Hell's landscape. The gun devil's fragments scattered through Hell had consolidated to confront him. He'd extracted them all. The Darkness Devil had emerged from whatever deep place it normally resided in, radiating power that made space itself recoil. Jin-Woo had fought it for 6 hours straight, the longest single combat he'd experienced since arriving in this world, and had emerged victorious. Darkness itself now served the Shadow Monarch, a poetic irony that Jin-Woo appreciated. The Control Devil's Hell manifestation had tried to override his authority, to claim dominion over his shadows through sheer force of conceptual power. Jin-Woo had crushed that attempt with casual efficiency, demonstrating that control meant nothing in the face of absolute authority. Each king that fell was extracted. Each fundamental fear was consumed and remade as a soldier in his army. By the 40th layer, Hell had started to break down, not physically, but structurally. The ecosystem that had existed here for potentially millions of years was collapsing as Jin-Woo systematically removed its pillars. Devils were fleeing en masse, trying to escape to the human world or to deeper refuges that might not exist. The layers themselves were becoming unstable, bleeding into each other as the boundaries that separated them lost definition. Jin-Woo continued descending, unmoved by the chaos his passage created. He'd reached the 50th layer when he found what he'd been unconsciously searching for: the bottom. Not the literal bottom of Hell, which might not exist as a concrete concept, but the functional bottom, the deepest layer where the strongest entities resided, the foundation upon which Hell's entire structure rested. It was a throne room of sorts, though calling it that implied grandeur that this place didn't possess. Just a vast empty space where reality seemed thin and uncertain, and at its center, a presence that Jin-Woo couldn't quite perceive directly. The Hell Devil, perhaps, or something older that had existed before devils were named and categorized. It didn't attack, didn't speak, simply existed, radiating a message that Jin-Woo understood without words: you do not belong here, leave. Jin-Woo had stood before that presence, his army arranged behind him in formations that covered every approach, and had spoken his response. No, one word, absolute and final. Then his shadows had surged forward, and Jin-Woo had fought what might have been Hell itself given form. The battle had lasted for what his system calculated as 18 hours. The space around them had broken and reformed repeatedly, reality struggling to contain the forces being unleashed. Jin-Woo had died 3 times, his body destroyed completely, only to resurrect immediately through authorities he'd claimed from the rulers and monarchs in his original world. Each death had made him more determined, each resurrection had refined his strategy, and in the end, standing over the dissolving essence of something that might have been a god in this world's cosmology, Jin-Woo had spoken the command that had become as natural as breathing. Arise. Hell's foundation had become his soldier. The oldest fear, the deepest darkness, the thing had existed beneath all other devils. It rose from its own death as shadow given purpose, and it bowed to Jin-Woo with the same absolute obedience as every other member of his army. And Hell had changed. Jin-Woo felt it happen in real time, felt the entire dimension restructure itself around a new center of gravity. Where before Hell had been a chaotic ecosystem of fear and rebirth, it was now something else, something organized. The layers stopped bleeding into each other, instead forming clear delineations like floors in a dungeon. The territories aligned themselves into zones with defined boundaries and consistent rules. The devils that remained, and there were still countless millions that Jin-Woo hadn't personally cleared, found themselves subject to a new order that hadn't existed before. Hell had become a system, and Jin-Woo, standing at its deepest point with an army that included Hell's own foundation, had become its administrator. He could feel it now, could sense Hell's structure the way he sensed his own shadow army. could perceive the flow of devils through its layers, could identify concentrations of power and potential threats, could, with a thought and sufficient will, reshape how hell functioned on a fundamental level. It was similar to the authority he'd possessed over his own world's dungeons, but vaster in scope, more comprehensive in implementation. Jin-Woo had spent another day in Hell, the 24th layer, which had reorganized itself into something like a central command position, establishing basic parameters. Devils could still be reborn here when killed in the human world. That cycle was too fundamental to Hell's nature to simply erase. But now those reborn devils would find themselves in a structured environment rather than a chaotic one. Layers organized by power level, territories with clear rules. And most importantly, oversight. Jin-Woo's shadows now patrolled Hell's layers, maintaining order and eliminating devils that grew too powerful or too chaotic. Hell had bosses now in the literal dungeon sense, powerful devils that Jin-Woo had extracted and then placed as guardians of specific layers, their role to manage the lesser devils and prevent the kind of uncontrolled power accumulation that might threaten the system's stability. It was efficient, orderly. A vast improvement over the previous chaos. When Jin-Woo finally emerged back into the human world, stepping through a spatial tier he created with casual expertise, he'd been gone for 4 days by Earth's time. He'd returned to the same alley where the fight that had sent him to Hell had originally occurred, his shadow army invisible but present, his power increased by several orders of magnitude from all the extractions he'd performed. Hell still existed, devils would still be reborn there and return to threaten humanity. But now Hell operated according to rules that Jin-Woo had established, within structures he'd imposed, under oversight he maintained through his shadows. The dimension that had been pure chaos was now, functionally, his dungeon. A vast, multi-layered dungeon filled with millions of monsters of varying power levels, all of which existed within a system he understood and controlled. Jin-Woo walked out of the alley into Tokyo's midnight streets, his expression unchanged, his stride unhurried. Somewhere in this city, Makima was probably monitoring his return, trying to understand where he'd been and what had happened. Other devils were certainly sensing the change, feeling Hell's new structure and wondering what it meant for their existence. And in Hell itself, millions of devils were learning a new truth about their dimension. It had a floor now, multiple floors. Bosses and zones and rules that hadn't existed before. Hell had learned the meaning of a dungeon. And dungeons, as every monster that had ever faced the Shadow Monarch eventually learned, existed to be cleared by someone stronger than anything they contained. Jin-Woo's shadow stretched long in the streetlight, darker and more substantial than before. Within it, an army waited that now included the very foundation of Hell itself. He'd gone to another dimension and in 4 days had conquered it, restructured it, and turned it into a resource that would continue feeding his power indefinitely. It was, Jin-Woo reflected with mild satisfaction, a productive trip. Hell was his now. Just another dungeon that had been cleared by Earth's strongest hunter. Just another system that had met the Shadow Monarch and learned to bow. It started small, the way most apocalypses do. A news report from Kyoto about a devil attack that had been stopped before public safety could respond. Then another from Osaka. Then 3 more from smaller cities across Japan. Within a week, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Devils were being eliminated with unprecedented efficiency by an unknown entity that arrived, killed the threat, and disappeared before anyone could properly document what had happened. The only consistent detail across all reports was the shadows. Witnesses described darkness that moved with purpose, soldiers made of black smoke and purple flame, and a man who watched the carnage with purple eyes that held no fear, no hesitation, no humanity that observers could recognize. The media had tried various names. The Shadow Hunter, the Silent Executioner, the Man Who Walks in Darkness. None of them stuck because Jin-Woo didn't acknowledge any of them, didn't grant interviews, or make public statements. He simply continued his methodical elimination of devils across Japan, expanding his operations with the same systematic approach he'd applied to Hell itself. Within 2 months, devil attack mortality rates in Japan had dropped by 40%. Within 4 months, 60%. Public safety's devil hunters found themselves arriving at incident sites only to discover their targets already eliminated, devil corpses dissolving into ash or sometimes not even that, just empty spaces where devils had been, consumed entirely by shadows that left no trace. The change in public consciousness happened gradually at first, then all at once in the way that paradigm shifts often do. People started to notice that devil attacks, while still occurring, were becoming less lethal. That the random chance of dying to a devil on your way to work was decreasing week by week. that there was something out there, someone out there, who killed devils with the same casual efficiency that devils had once killed humans. The fear didn't disappear overnight. Fear that had been cultivated over generations, woven into the fabric of society, couldn't simply evaporate, but it began to change, to shift. Instead of fearing devils as an inevitable force of nature, people began to fear them as a solvable problem. And when something becomes solvable, when people believe that protection exists, the existential terror that feeds devils begins to starve. Makima had noticed the trend before anyone else, of course. Her information networks were more comprehensive than any government agency, her analytical capabilities enhanced by centuries of observation and manipulation. She'd watched the data compile with growing concern that she masked behind her usual pleasant smile. Devil power levels were declining, not dramatically, not yet, but measurably. Devils that should have regenerated from injuries within hours were taking days. Devils that should have possessed strength to overturn cars were struggling to break windows. The correlation was undeniable. As Jin-Woo's operations expanded and public awareness of his existence grew, the collective fear that empowered devils was being diluted by something else. Hope, perhaps, or the more insidious belief that devils weren't the apex predators of human civilization anymore, that there was something stronger, something that hunted the hunters. Makima had called an emergency meeting of department heads, her golden-ringed eyes scanning the assembled devil hunters with an intensity that made several of them shift uncomfortably. "The devil population is destabilizing," she'd said, her voice carrying its usual pleasant tone that somehow made the words more ominous. "Our projections indicate that if current trends continue, we'll see a 15% reduction in average devil power levels within 6 months. 25% within a year." The implications had hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Public safety's entire operational framework was built on the assumption of consistent devil threat levels. Contracts were negotiated based on expected power differentials. Strategies were developed around known capabilities. The entire economy of devil hunting, both official and underground, operated on the principle that devils were a constant, manageable threat. If devils weakened systematically, the entire structure would need to be rebuilt, and that was just the practical consideration. The metaphysical implications were far more profound. Devils existed because humans feared. That was the fundamental law of this world, as basic as gravity or thermodynamics. If that law was being violated, if fear could be diminished to the point where devils lost power, then the entire cosmological structure that humanity had learned to live within was subject to change. And change, in Makima's carefully controlled world, was just another word for chaos that threatened her plans. But it wasn't just devils weakening that concerned her. It was what was growing stronger in fear's place, because humans hadn't stopped being afraid. They'd simply redirected their fear toward a new target. The first shrine appeared in Shinjuku, a small informal thing set up in an alley where Jin-Woo had killed a devil that had been terrorizing the neighborhood for weeks. Someone had left flowers and a handwritten note thanking the Shadow. Within days, more offerings appeared: food, money, small trinkets. The shrine grew. Other shrines appeared in other locations where Jin-Woo had operated spontaneous expressions of gratitude that looked uncomfortably like worship. The media picked up the story, of course. Human interest pieces about the mysterious protector, debates about vigilante justice versus official authority, think pieces about the psychology of hero worship in modern society. But underneath the surface-level discussion, something deeper was happening. People were beginning to fear Jin-Woo. Not the visceral terror that devils inspired, not the existential dread of being consumed or destroyed, but the deeper, more profound fear that comes from recognizing something absolutely beyond your control or comprehension. The fear of power so vast that it operates outside all human systems of law and morality. The fear of an authority that answers to nothing and no one. The fear of realizing that your survival is entirely dependent on the whims of something that could erase you without effort or consequence. It was a different quality of fear than what devils generated, but it was no less real. And as that fear grew and spread through the collective unconscious, it began to have effects. Jin-Woo himself noticed it first, though he didn't immediately understand what he was sensing. His shadow felt heavier, more substantial. His soldiers moved with increased precision and power. His own abilities, which had been stable since arriving in this world, began to strengthen in ways that his system couldn't fully quantify. He was growing more powerful not through leveling or extraction, but through something else. Something that resonated with this world's fundamental rules about fear and power. It took him several weeks to understand what was happening. and when he did, the realization was both fascinating and slightly troubling. This world operated on the principle that fear gave birth to devils and empowered them. The more humans feared a concept, the stronger its devil became. But Jin-Woo wasn't a devil. He was something from outside this world system entirely, operating according to different rules. Yet he existed within this world now, subject to its ambient metaphysical laws even if his core nature remained unchanged. And humans were beginning to fear him, not as a concept or an abstract threat, but as a specific individual entity. The Shadow Monarch, the man who killed devils, the thing that hunted in darkness with an army of the dead. They feared his power, feared his independence, feared the implications of his existence. And that fear, diffuse and widespread across millions of people, was beginning to feed him the same way fear of specific concepts fed devils. He was becoming, in effect, a hybrid entity, still fundamentally the Shadow Monarch from another dimension, but now also something that drew strength from this world's fear-based power system. The more people feared him, the stronger he became. And the stronger he became, the more effectively he eliminated devils, which made people fear devils less, which weakened devils further, which made Jin-Woo's relative power even more overwhelming, which made people fear him more. It was a feedback loop, self-reinforcing and accelerating. Jin-Woo stood on a rooftop overlooking Tokyo, his shadow spreading across the building's surface like spilled ink, and considered the implications. The world was changing around him. Devils were weakening as human fear of them diminished. His own power was growing as he became the new focal point of that fear. The ecosystem that had existed here for potentially thousands of years was being disrupted by his presence, restructured around a new apex predator that didn't fit into any existing category. Public safety had noticed, of course. Makima had increased surveillance on him exponentially, throwing resources at the problem of understanding and potentially controlling him. Other organizations, international devil hunter groups, private military contractors, underground devil worshippers, had started taking an interest in the entity that was reshaping their world's power dynamics. And devils themselves, the ones intelligent enough to recognize existential threats, had begun to respond. Some fled, trying to minimize their presence in the human world to avoid attracting his attention. Others formed unprecedented alliances, enemies cooperating against the common threat. A few, the oldest and most powerful, had started hunting him actively, recognizing that their continued existence required his elimination. Jin-Woo had killed them all. Every alliance, every ambush, every carefully planned assault by devils desperate to remove the threat he represented, all had ended the same way. His shadows consumed them, his authority over death proved absolute, and his army grew with each victory. The cycle continued. By the 6th month since his arrival, the change was undeniable and visible to everyone. Devil attacks had decreased by 70%. The ones that still occurred were noticeably weaker, devils struggling to manifest their full power in a world where human fear of them was being overshadowed by fear of something else. The economy had started to shift. Devil hunter jobs were becoming less lucrative as demand decreased. Public safety's budget was being questioned by government officials who wondered why they were funding such a massive organization when devil threats were clearly declining. The entire social structure that had been built around the constant threat of devil attacks was beginning to collapse, and no one knew what would replace it, except Makima. She knew exactly what was replacing it. Jin-Woo was replacing it. One man, one army, one absolute authority that was systematically dismantling the devil-based ecosystem and restructuring it around himself. He was becoming, whether he intended to or not, the central pillar of this world's power structure, the thing that everyone else's survival depended on. The variable that determined whether devils posed a threat or merely an inconvenience. And as that transformation completed, as the world fully transitioned from fearing devils to fearing Jin-Woo, something unprecedented would occur. Devils were born from fear. That was the fundamental rule. But what happened when the world's fear became focused not on concepts or abstract threats, but on a single, specific individual? What happened when millions of people feared one man more than they feared death, darkness, violence, or any other primal terror? Makima had run the calculations, had extrapolated the trends, had consulted with the oldest devils who possessed knowledge of this world's metaphysical laws. The answer was clear, inevitable, and catastrophic for her plans. Jin-Woo would become a devil, not by transformation or corruption, but by assimilation. This world would recognize him as its new primal fear, the conceptual entity that existed at the foundation of human terror. He would gain all the authorities and powers that came with being a devil, while retaining everything he already was. He he would become functionally unkillable by this world's laws, capable of resurrection and regeneration as long as humans feared him. And humans would always fear him, because he was real and present and visible in a way that abstract concepts never were. The control devil had existed for as long as humans had feared being controlled. The darkness devil had existed for as long as humans had feared the dark. These were ancient, primal fears that would never fully disappear. But the fear of Jin-Woo, the Shadow Monarch, the man who conquered hell, the entity that killed with casual, absolute efficiency, that fear was growing stronger than any conceptual fear because it was personal. You could rationalize away your fear of the dark by turning on lights. You could cope with fear of control by believing in freedom. But you couldn't rationalize away Jin-Woo. He was there, real, unstoppable, and growing more powerful with every day that passed. The world was stopping its fear of devils because it had found something more worthy of terror. Makima stood in her office, hands clasped behind her back, staring at Tokyo's nighttime skyline with golden eyes that reflected the city lights. Somewhere out there, Jin-Woo was hunting. His shadows were spreading through the city's darkness. His army was eliminating devils with mechanical precision, and his power was growing with every person who heard about him and felt that instinctive recoil of fear. Her perfect world, the one she'd spent centuries cultivating, was becoming impossible. You couldn't control someone who was becoming a primal fear. You couldn't manipulate someone who the entire world feared more than death itself. Her only remaining option was acceleration, completing her plans before Jin-Woo's transformation finished, creating her controlled paradise before he became so powerful that nothing could stand against him. But even as she thought it, Makima knew the truth. She'd already lost. The moment Jin-Woo had arrived in this world, the moment he'd started systematically eliminating devils and restructuring hell itself, her defeat had become inevitable. It had just taken time for the consequences to become visible. The world was changing, devils were weakening, fear was being redirected toward a single entity who grew stronger from that fear and used that strength to further reduce the devil threat. The feedback loop would continue until it reached its logical conclusion, a world where devils were negligible threats at best, where human civilization could finally exist without the constant shadow of conceptual horrors, where safety was assured not by government agencies or devil hunters, but by one man and his infinite army of shadows. It should have been a happy ending. Humanity saved from the devils that had plagued them for millennia, but Makima understood what most people didn't. Replacing devils with Jin-Woo was. And salvation, it was just exchanging one form of existential terror for another. Devils were cruel and destructive, but they were also predictable, manageable. You could build systems around them, make contracts, establish rules of engagement. Jin-Woo was none of those things. He operated entirely according to his own internal logic, answered to no authority, acknowledged no limitations. He was, in the most fundamental sense, beyond control. And a world that had learned to live with devils by controlling and managing them would now have to learn to live with Jin-Woo by accepting that control was no longer possible. The final irony, the thing that made Makima's perfect composure finally crack into something resembling genuine emotion, was that Jin-Woo probably didn't even want the power he was accumulating, didn't seek worship or fear or dominion over human civilization. He was just doing what he'd always done, eliminating threats efficiently, protecting people as a natural consequence of his operations, existing as the overwhelming force he'd become through survival and determination. But intent didn't matter, effect mattered, and the effect of Jin-Woo's presence in this world was a complete restructuring of its fundamental power dynamics. Devils were born from fear, but what happened when the world feared only one man? The answer was writing itself across Tokyo's skyline in shadows that moved with purpose, in shrines that were beginning to look less like gratitude and more like propitiation, in the collective unconscious shift that was transforming Jin-Woo from protector to primal fear. The Chainsaw Man world was changing forever. The age of devils was ending, and the age of the Shadow Monarch was beginning, whether anyone wanted it or not. Jin-Woo stood in an alley, having just eliminated another devil, and felt the change in the air around him. Fear, dense and thick and directed entirely at him, not from the devil he'd killed that had died too quickly for fear, from the humans watching from windows and doorways, witnessing his power and understanding on some instinctive level that they were looking at something that transcended their comprehension. They feared him, and their fear made him stronger. And that strength would protect them from devils, and that protection would make them fear him more. The cycle was complete, inescapable, eternal. The world had stopped fearing devils. Now it feared only the Shadow Monarch, and in this world fear was power, absolute, undeniable, world-reshaping power. Jin-Woo's shadow stretched across the alley, darker than any natural shadow should be, and within it, an army waited that now included the fears of an entire civilization. He'd saved this world from devils. And in doing so had become something far more terrifying than any devil had ever been, not through cruelty or malice, but through the simple, inescapable fact of his existence. The world had learned to fear him, and that fear would never fade.